begin, I wasn't at the United Church last night, so I imagine a great many people here were there, and I don't know that it's necessary to go over much of the same territory. But to begin with, I'd just like to ask Dr. Halper, what is the purpose of your visit here?
Well, I think I'm starting to work, I've been working on the issue of Israel-Palestine, our conflict, for many, many years. I've lived in Israel for 42 years now. It continues to be, I think, one of the most tragic and one of the most important conflicts in the world. But at the same time, I'm aware of the fact that as more and more it's becoming globalized. I mean, just being here in Canada for 3 weeks, I feel at home. I mean, your whole national discourse is the Israeli discourse. It's security, terrorism, and I've heard that when you have your elections in October or before, terrorism is going to be the major electoral issue. So I think there's a spillover from the Middle East into the rest of the world, where this conflict is not only disruptive of the Middle East as a region, I think it's getting disruptive of the whole international system. And I think from my point of view at least, as neoliberalism gets stronger in the world, you're going to have an increase in militarism and an increase in repression. In Canada, your police forces are getting militarized. So as I go abroad, I begin to see how much both the discourse but also the weaponry that Israel exports is beginning to get into societies like Canada and the United States and elsewhere. In other words, Israel's exporting its occupation. So that there's a concept called global Palestine that I'm working on. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to sort of alert people to the fact that they're being Palestinianized, that you're becoming, I think what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank is not only a tragedy for Palestinians, I think it poses a direct threat to civil liberties everywhere in the world, because the Palestinians are not the end users. The Palestinians are the channels, even the guinea pigs, for these weapons and security systems and tactics, but you're the end users. The whole idea is that it's coming into your society. So together with trying to mobilize people against Israel's occupation for a just peace, the idea is also to say, you're stakeholders. This isn't just some faraway conflict that you should be concerned about because you're concerned about Palestinians and Israelis. This is a conflict that's coming home into your society, and to raise consciousness about that.
But isn't there a double standard in holding Israel to account on various issues? And for instance, the conflict in the Middle East now is taken on so many different levels. You have the conflict with ISIS, you have the conflict internally in various countries, you have the conflict between Sunnis and Shias. The Israel-Palestinian conflict is one aspect of what's going on in the Middle East. What about everything else that's going on? People would accuse you of ignoring all of the travesties that occur in the Arab world on every day, simply to focus on what Israel is doing wrong.
Well, first of all, John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, said last month in the New York Times that you're not going to resolve the wider issues of the Middle East. I mean, the whole Middle East is in a meltdown, with Shiites and Sunnis and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Syria and Lebanon and Iran and Iraq and everything that's going on. Yemen now, North Africa. And you're not going to be able to stabilize this important geopolitical part of the world and get on with development and lower the alienation, the polarization, the violence, without resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. And he's echoing what James Baker said 10 years ago regarding Iraq. In other words, the Israel-Palestine conflict doesn't cause, obviously, all these other conflicts, but it becomes this real aggravating factor that keeps the militarism alive. You know, Israel's getting $30 billion in new arms from the United States over a 10-year period. Saudi Arabia just bought $74 billion of arms from the U.S. The arms that's poured in, the militarism, the hatreds, the polarization and the alienation between the West and the Muslim world, all these things have a lot to do with the Israel-Palestine conflict. Again, it doesn't cause it, but it prevents us from getting on to deal with these issues. So, you know, and I'm an Israeli. I mean, I have to be concerned about what I can do. I can't get in between ISIS and Assad. But I am saying always that that the only way to solve these are all symptoms. They're symptoms of still a reaction to colonialism. We're living in a Middle East that was artificially created by the European powers, where the states generate conflict, their borders divide people. You know, we're still trying to figure out how to reconstitute the Middle East with an Israel in it, which is also a kind of a colonial implant. How do we create a Middle East in which genuinely people have an economic future, where people have a cultural and religious expression, and the global north, the United States, Canada, countries that are attacking us, or supporting Israel in its occupation, and are against human rights. I mean, supporting regimes like Sisi's regime in Egypt. You know, goes well. I mean, you could ask the same question of the United States. Why are you supporting all these dictators when you're trying to further human rights and democracy? In other words, we've got to start thinking regionally, trying to figure out how do we reconstitute the Middle East in a way that addresses the issues, the grievances behind this violence. And my piece of that is to say, okay, I have a certain piece in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict that I can contribute that's important, and I see that as sort of the focus of my work. So I'm not focusing, I think, unfairly on Israel. I simply can't do everything. And as an Israeli Jew, I certainly have a role to play, a legitimate role to play in part of the conflict in the Middle East that I can speak about.
All right. Now, speaking about at this point, I want to ask you about the one-state solution, which you have written about. There's been much written about the idea of a one-state solution, which to me seems one of the most amorphous subjects possible. It can have any possible interpretation that you want. What do you see as a one-state solution?
Well, first of all, I have to say that myself personally and the Israeli peace movement always supported the two-state solution. The two-state solution was fine with us. It's not fair and just, but as long as the Palestinians accepted it, and the PLO accepted the two-state solution in 1988, so we're talking about 27 years ago, it's okay. If they accept it, who am I to say no? So the two-state solution, the idea of two states for two peoples, is fine with the Israeli left. It's not that we're against it. We've simply come to the conclusion, I think, certainly the critical Israeli left, from being there, from both knowing Israeli policies and politics, but also seeing the facts on the ground, that the two-state solution is simply dead. Israel eliminated it. And it wasn't hard to do, 47 years where you intentionally and systematically destroy any possibility of a Palestinian state, you get to a point where it's done, it's over. Which means then that the only solution is a one-state solution. In other words, if it's true, and I kind of put it on maps because I thought for people it would be more, in other words, if the two-state solution is finished, and that's the only solution that leaves Israel as a Jewish state. In other words, if both Israeli Jews and Jews abroad want Israel somehow to be a Jewish state, even that's a problem, because only 70% or so of Israelis are actually Jewish. But that's another issue. If you want a Jewish state, fine. Here you have a state on 78% of this country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, accepted by the Palestinians, accepted by the Arab League, accepted by the international community. You won. Yeah, Zionism won. The minute the PLO said, we recognize Israel within these borders, 27 years ago, we won. Fine, great. Now we've got Israel, it's legitimate, it's Jewish, and it's on 78% of the country. But that wasn't enough for some reason. And so Israel said, no, we want the whole thing. And in fact, today they have the whole thing. It's over. There's only one government in this region. There's only one police force. There's only one army. There's only one electrical system. There's only one currency. You know, there's only one authority. So Israel has de facto, that's the point I'm making, Israel has made this into one state. It is one state. The whole issue, should it be two states or one state, is gone. Israel resolved that issue. It consciously and systematically and deliberately eliminated the two-state solution and created one state. Now the problem is that it's an apartheid state. It's a state, it's one state in which Jews have a privileged position, obviously, over Palestinians, and Palestinians are locked into a kind of a Bantustan. That, I think, it should be unacceptable to everybody, Jews at the forefront. And therefore, it seems to me the only alternative is to turn this one state that Israel created into a state of equal rights for all its citizens. In other words, a democratic state that shouldn't be such a foreign concept to Canadians, a democratic state that's nevertheless binational. And here again, I think Canada provides a certain model. You're, in a sense, I don't know, a binational state, but certainly a bicultural state, a bilingual state, the francophones, the anglophones, and that's, in a sense, what we have to get to here. One state of equal citizenship for everyone, but nevertheless which acknowledges and guarantees the integrity of the two national groups living in the country, Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. Now, it's vague because right now this is academic. I mean, nobody's talking about it. It's a nice academic discourse. I think what's going to happen is that this whole system's going to collapse. I'm predicting fairly soon. I don't think it's sustainable. I think the Palestinian Authority is going to collapse, which is the game changer from my point of view. And then new possibilities open up. There's a good chance if the PA collapses that Israel's going to have to reoccupy the Palestinian cities and Gaza. It can't allow that vacuum. I think that would inflame the Muslim world. I think it would inflame the world beyond. It would force the hand of the international community, is kind of my scenario. And in that chaos and collapse that happens, then I think possibilities that don't exist today will become relevant. And the only possibility of resolving this is a binational democratic state. And what I agree with you, that it's too vague right now. I've been urging our Palestinian partners to sit down with us. We on the left should begin to really define and flesh out what we mean by one democratic state. You know, the advantage of, the important thing that the ANC did in South Africa before the end of apartheid was to present a freedom charter that said, our vision of the future of South Africa is multiracial. And that's what allowed the Afrikaners and the whites to join when apartheid fell, to join because they knew that they had a place in the new South Africa. We're not there. We need a freedom charter that says our vision of a future one state is inclusive of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. Now we have to build it and organize it and structure it. But if that principle is stated and articulated, I think Israeli Jews themselves would go along with. For Israeli Jews, what they care about is less territory. The greater land of Israel idea never ever got much legitimacy in Israel. The actual settlers, the religious crazy settlers that are violent in the West Bank and so on, are 1% of the Israeli population. So if the Israeli Jewish population overall can be guaranteed, assured, that their collective and individual rights will be respected in a future state, one state, I think they could be brought into that equation. We're not there yet. That collapse has to happen, and I think you're right. I think we do have to flesh it out more, which we're not doing. But I think that that's, from my point of view, the only way out.
No? Sort of launching from that into another area that you have been associated with, the BDS movement, boycott, divest, sanctions. I have a couple of questions. One is, you yourself were a professor in Israel, correct? But the boycott, divest, sanctions movement calls for the boycotting of Israeli academics. So ipso facto, you yourself would have been boycotted a few years ago, or even now, if you had remained a professor. Meaning you cast a wide net, punishing everyone in one fell swoop for something that they may not have done. That's one question. The other is, there was a specific targeting of 3 companies last year, including SodaStream. And SodaStream, whether it was justified in establishing a plant in the West Bank in the first place or not, was, I think, mostly regarded as a decent employer that employed, I believe, something like 450 Palestinians. Then, when it also said, the chair of SodaStream said they would be willing to maintain operations even under a Palestinian government, should that be the case, but they were told they have to pick up and move, and they did move. Now, so answer me this, would you yourself, would you have been subject to a boycott had you remained a professor? And secondly, how do you respond to the accusations? Do you force a good company out, costing Palestinians jobs?
Well, we support the BDS movement, boycotts, divestment, sanctions. We have from the very beginning. Matter of fact, we were supporting that movement before it was called BDS, because we believe that human rights today, we're past the time when a country can say, this is our internal affairs, you butt out. This is an Israeli issue, you foreigners stay out. And we have precedences in other countries where Jews were persecuted, where that was the line. This is a German problem, you people stay out of it. Human rights is universal, and it imposes on everyone a duty to assure that human rights are respected everywhere in the world. They don't have borders. And so the BDS movement is basically saying to everyone, and not only on Israel-Palestine, obviously, there's human rights movements about Tibet and over the Congo and over, there's human rights movements, if you look at Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, over hundreds of conflicts in the world. But in terms of our conflict, we're saying, yes, there's a point where the international community has to intervene in order to prevent Israel from continuing the occupation. And this is a situation like South Africa in which the local population can't do it. The Palestinians can't overthrow the occupation, obviously. They've tried in many different ways. And the Israeli Jews aren't going to do it. They're living very well with the occupation. The whites in South Africa were living very well with apartheid. They would not have risen up themselves unless there was foreign pressures, and the whole situation became economically and politically and morally untenable for them. Churches started to speak out and trade unions. We have to do that with Israel-Palestine to make this unsustainable. And that's where I think BDS plays a role. The academic boycott is a part of it. The Israeli academic institutions are complicit. The Technion, which is really Israel's main technical university, but is really the main largest laboratory for the Israeli army, has a joint partnership with the University of Manitoba. I mean, your university in your city is absolutely complicit in developing weapon systems and these technologies and bringing these technologies into Canada. That should be a concern not just for Israelis, but for Canadians as well. Now, the academic boycott, just to make it clear, is not against individual scholars. I would not suffer as an individual scholar. If I was still at Ben Gurion and I was invited to a conference in Winnipeg, I could come, I could publish. It's not intended against individual scholars. I would never support something like that. What it does do, and that's true, where I would suffer if I was still at the university, is I couldn't get funding, or there shouldn't be funding for joint research projects between Israeli universities and universities abroad. In other words, the universities as institutions have to be made accountable for what they're doing. Palestinian universities are closed down all the time, and Israeli universities don't do a thing. Birzeit University, Al-Quds University in Jerusalem have walls through the campus. You know, and there's never been any solidarity for them with Israeli universities. Faculty and students can't study freely, can't teach freely. All of this, and Israeli universities are very complicit in the military. They train the military, they develop weapon systems for the military, and I think that makes them not only appropriate targets, but I think that really, I think, infects the integrity of the academic, of the morality of the academic life. So yes, I do support the academic boycott. The other
What is SodaStream?
And with SodaStream, you know, it's a problem. You know, in a boycott situation, you're always caught between the short term and the long term. You know, Palestinians, it's true, as casual laborers, dependent on the Israeli economy, closed out of the Israeli economy. And that's why they're cheap labor sources in the West Bank, because they're not allowed to come into Israel. Are very dependent on the Israeli economy. The question is, you know, strategically, you know, what do you have to do in order to end that situation and to create a situation of equality? And sometimes it's true, people get hurt, and it's often the poor people and the working people that get hurt, but at the same time, there's no alternative if you want to end the system of oppression. With SodaStream, they weren't so great to their workers. In fact, I think the 500 workers, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think I am, were fired last year because where SodaStream was located in the Ma'ale Adumim Industrial Park, Palestinian workers couldn't drive in. You know, they have to walk to work, and a long way from the west into the Ma'ale Adumim settlement, and it was Ramadan. They weren't eating all day, and what they wanted was to have food ready for them so that at the end of their shift, before walking all the way back and then taking taxis all the way back to their villages, that they could eat at the plant before they went home. And SodaStream said no, under the pretext that it would violate their kosher premises or something. And the workers struck, and they were all fired. So it's not such a friendly company. And then it moved into Israel, which is true. But to tell you the truth, we favor boycotting all Israeli products, not simply settlement products. So the fact that they moved into Israel, I mean, maybe they're not the greatest target. I've never been a fan of the SodaStream target. I think there's better targets. But just because they moved inside Israel doesn't mean that they're kosher now. So we're in favor of boycotting all Israeli products because Israel is the country that's responsible. It's not the settlements responsible for the occupation. And you know, I mean, again, it's a hard call. I mean, I'd be willing to suffer as an academic to support the academic boycott. And I can't really speak for workers. That's much harder, Palestinian workers. But the principle is at least that has to happen in order for the occupation to end.
I think there are a few minutes left. We were going to open it up to questions, but I want to ask one more question. Or you were going to give me the cue when?
Still 10 minutes.
Still 10 minutes. Okay. I want to speak now as an individual Jew living in Canada, a liberal Jew who likes to pride himself on having a moral compass. And the quandary that individuals like you and some of the people who are also here put people like me in, where we don't want to be seen as defending Israel in a knee-jerk fashion, but when you criticize them in such categorical ways, saying, you know, end to the Jewish state, you know, boycott all Israeli products, we inevitably find ourselves coming to Israel's defense. Whether we agree with most Israeli policies or not, we say you're attacking Israel in such a harsh manner, again, there's no criticism of Hamas, there's no criticism of any of the Muslim fundamentalists who are on the ascendant in the Middle East. It's just a unilateral attack on Israel. And people like me, even though I want to give full forum to even the harshest critics of Israel, which I have in my newspaper, at the same time I find it hard-pressed to not to come to Israel's defense. Do you realize what a difficult situation you put liberal Jews like me in?
I do, and I appreciate sincerely the fact that we're talking, and that you're willing to listen and to ask and to make your own views heard. I think that's missing today. I very seldom get any access to the Jewish community, and you know, I always ask myself, if you really care about Israel, if you really love Israel, wouldn't you want to hear as much as you can, all the different opinions, you know, even things you don't agree with, just to be sure that you have the best position that'll help Israel? You know, in other words, being critical of Israel doesn't mean being against Israel. On the contrary, I think in some ways, I mean, I live there. I live there, my children live there, my grandchildren live there. I mean, nobody has more of a stake in Israel surviving and thriving than I do. But at the same time, first of all, I think Israel's on a suicide course. And this whole idea of supporting these crazy Likud, right-wing, Bennett religious policies as if that's Israel. That's not Israel. People are supporting one sliver of a right-wing agenda of Israel and calling that Israel. It's like saying Harper is Canada. It's not this. If you criticize Harper, you're making all Canadians defensive. No. And I guess one thing I say to Jewish audiences, it sounds funny, but it's true. Israel's a foreign country. It's a foreign country. You don't know Israel. You don't live there. You don't vote there. You don't know the humor of the country. I mean, just like I don't know Canada. I couldn't get up and talk about, if I started talking about Canadian politics, having been here for a few weeks and having grown up in northern Minnesota, so I know a little bit, you guys would say, hey, you're off. You just don't know enough to really be able to say that. And it's the same the other way around. Sometimes people feel somehow entitled to defend Israel. They're training all these kids to be Israel advocates at universities. Why should they be my advocate? What do they know about my country? In other words, they're presenting my country, they're defending my country, they're explaining my country that they don't know anything about. It's a foreign country. They wouldn't do that with Brazil or with China or with Belgium. Why could you do? There's no respect for Israel here, because the whole idea somehow is Israel has no agency. It's just this little country defending itself, and we have to defend Israel. And what I'm saying as an Israeli is no. Israel's a foreign country. It's a powerful country, which is something that Jews don't like to hear, ironically, because they're clinging to the idea that we're the victims. we're the little ghetto boy in this tough neighborhood of bullies, and we're just defending ourselves, because that way you can't be held accountable. And somehow, Israeli policies don't figure into the equation. I mean, Israel's the occupying power. Israel's the fourth largest nuclear power in the world. You know, Israel's the second largest arms supplier to China and India. It has an army at the level of any advanced European army. It's a major violator of human rights. According to the American State Department, every year it's a major violator of human rights. It does outrageous things. It's completely violating international law. Why shouldn't it be criticized? You're going to take the fourth largest nuclear country in the world and say you can't criticize it? So this whole thing of somehow not holding Israel accountable, that somehow it's this country that's so vulnerable, simply is not the case. If Israel could be held accountable for its policies and reined in a bit by the Jewish community that has a certain cachet with the Israelis. I mean, you guys, the Jews here, have much more influence on Netanyahu and the government. If Canadian Jews would begin to say to Israel, hey, you know, think about a two-state solution. Think about, you know, I think, for example, Israel is putting Jews in harm's way. This whole idea that Netanyahu, it was in Haaretz yesterday. Netanyahu says, I'm going to the American Congress and I'm speaking in the name of all the Jews of the world. Not the Israeli prime minister, the prime minister of a foreign country. He's speaking in your name. Now, people then get upset. The Jews get upset, like in Paris. Why are they attacking the Jews? You know, it's anti-Semitism. They're not separating Jews from Israelis. We're being held accountable for Israeli policies. Well, yes, you are, because you're not distancing yourself from that. If Jews here would say, not in my name, I love Israel, I wish Israel all the best, but Israel does not represent me. And I demand that there be a separation between Israeli policies and me as a Jew. Netanyahu does not represent me. Then you could legitimately say blurring Jews and Israelis is a kind of anti-Semitism, it's not fair, and so on. But you can't say that if the Jewish community here comes out and says, yes, Netanyahu does represent us. We're waving the Israeli flag in our synagogues. We're proto-Israelis. Well, if that's the case, then you're complicit in this. And what Jews here don't understand, I guess, I don't know, is that Israeli policies are 180 degrees diametrically opposed to all the Jewish values in this country. Jews have, in my view, Jews in the diaspora, especially, maybe not the Orthodox so much, but the vast majority of Jews, are defined by social justice. Jews are proud of that. In Nelson Mandela's first government, there were 5 white ministers. They were all Jews. You know, the civil rights movement, anti-war movements, human rights. The author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was René Cassin, a French Jew. He was the Thomas Jefferson of the world of human rights. We're proud of that. That defines us. And all of a sudden, to say, but we're also going to support a state that's apartheid, that violates human rights, that's occupied Palestinians for half a century, that doesn't give them any rights. How do you reconcile those things? It undercuts the very integrity of being Jewish. So that Israel, I'm writing an article now that I'm entitling Zionism Murdered Judaism. Because I really think to the degree that the Jews have been dragged into that, and they're defining themselves not by Jewish values, but by what Netanyahu does, you know, in attacking Gaza, I think it's really terrible. So I guess my warning to Jews here is let Israel go. Israel's a foreign country. Let the Israelis deal with it. You can help us with human rights, but we don't need you to defend us. because you're not us. What right do you have to defend a country that isn't your country? And at the same time, not only let Israel go, get a life. Jews here, I think, have to stop identifying themselves with Israel. Israel's not a cult. It's not a religion. It can't give you meaning. It can't define you as Jews. Your Judaism has to be defined by your diaspora experience. And you have to legitimize that. And part of the tenet, one tenet of Zionism, it's very upfront, is the negation of the exile. Zionism says your lives have no meaning here as Jews. It's ephemeral. You're living on borrowed time. You have to say no. Our life in the diaspora can be rich. It can be Jewish. We validate it. We wish Israel well, but we're not Israelis. I want to come to Israel. I want to see an Israel at peace. I'll do what I can, but I'm not going to define myself by Israel. How do you define yourself by a foreign country? And I think that the Jews have to have a real deep discussion, I would think, among themselves, kind of an intra-Jewish discussion that I'd be happy to be a part of, in terms of really, what is Israel doing to us? And what are we becoming from this identification with a country with a terrible human rights record that's oppressing another people? I mean, the question I'm asked, I don't want to go on and on, the question I'm asked most as I travel around the world is how can Jews do this to the Palestinians after what they've suffered? And I think that's a question that we should be asking ourselves. After what we've gone through as a persecuted people, as the ones that articulated the world of human rights, how do we support a state that's antithetical to those values and that experience? I don't have an answer, but those are some of the questions I would pose to the organized Jewish community.
Well, one more question. You tell me. 5 minutes. All right. I want to follow up on your own personal experience, though. Again, there seems to be contradiction. By virtue of your being a Jew, you were allowed to emigrate to Israel and become a citizen of that country, which is part of the Zionist dream of creating a Jewish national homeland. If I can distinguish between Judaism, or being Jewish as a nationality, and Jewish as a religion. You are on one end of the spectrum of Jewish, extreme Jewish liberalism, more than that. But at the same time, would you deny Jews the right that other nationalities have to return to a home? Germans, wherever they are allowed to return to Germany, even if they've never lived there. Irish, too, can claim a vestigial right of return. A lot of other different nationalities allow that. But you have written that you do not want Israel to remain a Jewish state. Is there any way, but you yourself took advantage of that. Do you not see the contradiction in that?
No, because I think that Israel, first, Israel could have been a Jewish state. Again, Jewish in a certain way, if it had accepted the two-state solution. Then what Israel is in terms of how Israelis define Palestinian Israelis, Bedouin Israelis, Druze Israelis, Jewish Israelis, and so on, how they define themselves, that's another issue. But overall, Israel could have stayed with its flag and been Jewish and have the right of return for Jews if it had accepted. So Israel's the one, in a sense, that jettisoned the idea of a Jewish state. Because you can't take hold of the entire country with 4.5 million Palestinians permanently and then want to be a Jewish country. That's apartheid, and that doesn't work. Now, I'm not a Zionist per se, but I did move to Israel. Yeah, everybody's got their own biography. And in fact, when the 60s collapsed and I was alienated from American society, my Jewish identity became very important to me. It's kind of like, remember, everybody was going back to roots. The African Americans, roots with Alex Haley, Cesar Chavez, the Native Americans, and all of that, and I got caught up in that as well. It became known as identity politics, and I got caught up in that. And my I began to shift to my Jewish identity was the most important to me, more important than my American. But I'm not religious in any way. And so in a sense, going to Israel embedded me in an Israeli, I guess I'm saying I became an Israeli before I went to Israel. In terms of I stopped being an American, I stopped being an American Jew, and I started to be an Israeli from the point of view of my Jewish, even national identity. It's true, national identity becoming primary, and that's why I went to Israel and I stayed there. You know, and I feel at home there. I don't reject the idea of a Jewish nationality, or the fact that we have a tie to this country. And that gets me in trouble with my friends on the left, including my Palestinian friends, because the discourse more and more that we're starting to have is that Zionism is settler colonialism. And the Jews in Israel are like the French in Algeria. And I reject that. I say, no, this isn't a case of some farmer that got up one morning in England and goes to Kenya to get land and cheap labor. And no, there was a genuine, and is a genuine tie between the Jewish people in this country. And I felt it, and I feel it there. And I wanted to be a part of reviving the Hebrew language, and I was very involved in a movement called the Israel Congress that was trying to develop a Hebrew Israeli culture, you know, as opposed to, you know, Israel's getting sucked now back into kind of a religious right-wing culture. You know, in other words, I liked that. I wanted to help, but I understood, and I understand, that we have to do this together with the Palestinians. There's two streams of Zionism. One was political Zionism that said we need a state, and political Zionism said and says until today, this is our country exclusively. That's the fly in the ointment. There is no Palestinian people. There is no other claimant. This country is ours exclusively. That political Zionism that still reigns is exhausted itself. There was another strain of Zionism that was intellectuals, so it never succeeded, obviously. They didn't have an army, it didn't organize, that was called cultural Zionism. Ben Yehuda was a part of it, Ahat Ha'am was part of it, Henrietta Zold, who founded Hadassah, Judah Magnus, who was the first president of Hebrew University, Martin Buber, some pretty stellar figures, said, yes, we want to revive an Israeli national culture. We want to speak Hebrew, we want a Hebrew university, we want Hebrew language, but our self-determination as Israelis, let's say, our national expression, our right to self-determination does not have to end in a state. You can have, look at the Francophiles here, the Francophones. You can have a great deal of self-determination, institutions, language, a culture, a parliament, an economy, and so on, without it necessarily being a state. The Catalonians have that, the Basques have that, the Scotch, the Welsh, you know, you can go on and on. And that's where I think we have to bite the bullet and say this country has to be binational. There's two peoples here. Both have rights of self-determination. Both are national groups. But nevertheless, the two-state solution is gone. That expression of self-determination has been eliminated by Israel, and so we have to have a form of binational self-determination, and I want to be an Israeli national, and I'd love to have Jews come. I believe in the right of Jewish return, as well as the right of Palestinian return to this country, and will be binational. So I don't see any contradiction between those things. I just think that the whole idea that somehow this can be a Jewish state of Jews, exclusive, it's impossible. Even inside Israel, like I said, the Jews are only 70%. That can't be. So we have to find a more workable way of Jewish nationalism.
So we'd like to entertain a few questions. We've got about 10 minutes now.